We're now on Daf Chaf Dalid Amud Beis. Abba Shol Omer Af Beish Echad U'Shtei Nashim. Even though normally one man with two women is considered yichud, but not in this case because they're in a mental state which is not conducive at all to any sort of passion. There's mourning, there's grief and burial. The Ein Omdim Ola B'Shura. As far as this young infant is concerned, we're not going through the regular grief, mourning, and burial because we're talking about a tinok yotze b'cheik within 30 days of its birth. And therefore, there's no din of shura for nicham avelim. V'ein omrim all of other dimensions of nicham avelim that apply to burial, namely berchas avelim, an entire series of brachos, which is delineated in the Gemara Ksubis, or tanchumei avelim. No tanchumei avelim. However, ben shloshim, once the baby was born for a full 30-day period of time, and it's no longer a nefel, then yotze b'dluskima. Again, this is not a full coffin, 100% covered up mess, but it's some sort of a burial box, and that's covered. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, lo dluskima haniteles b'katev, ela haniteles ba'agapayim. According to Rabbi Yehuda, we're not talking about a box that you carry on your shoulder, which would be carried by one single person, but rather haniteles ba'agapayim, but rather the kind of luskimo that's carried by a minimum of two people, and that's a more respectful carrying of the deceased. And again, the child has already reached 30 days. Once it's reached 30 days, then the laws of Nicham Avelim apply. Ben Shnei Masar Chodesh, if the child is already a year old, Yotze B'mita, then we give it the full kavod of a regular mita. And Rabbi Akiva Omer, Hu ben shana ve'varav ki ben shtayim. If you have a child who is 1 year old and its limbs are like that of a 2-year-old, or hu ben shtayim ve'varav ki ben shana, its limbs are like that of a 1-year-old, but it's 2 years old, then yotze b'mita. As long as one of these two conditions have been met, it's either already 2 years old, or it's 1 year old, but its limbs are complete like a 2-year-old, then it gets the full kavod of a mita. So that if you want to take it out in a mita, then the infant has to be 2 years either in age or at least in its development. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, hayotze b'mita rabbi matzhivin olav. It means that there will be an expression of public grief. And why is that? Because according to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, ben Elazar, excuse me, there is, once a mita is used, then Rabbi Matzhivin Olav. If the child is old enough to be accorded that honor, that covet of being taken out in a mita, then the public should grieve over the child. It's not clear exactly how the public will express that grief. Rabbi Lozman Azariah Omer, Nikar LeRabim, Rabim is asking bo. Rashi explains that Nikar LeRabim shayu makirin kvar shahayu rogil lotzeis min habayis. So that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah makes the public grief over the loss of this infant depended upon the fact that people recognize, they know the child. He was Ragil Lotzeis Min Habayis. And the concept of Rav Shimon Elazar, Ayotzumita Rabbi Matzivin Olav, Rashi says, Matzivin Margishin Umitztarin. They should feel that pain. And then their cheeks get red from weeping. But Eino Nikol Rabim, Ein Rabim is asking Imo. We don't require all the rabbis to get involved in his burial for covered a mess if they don't recognize the child. The child has never been out there. It's not mature enough. Now, the Brisa discusses a series of various minhagim regarding the death of a child. Uma hein vehesped, Rabbi Meir b'shem, Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Aniyim b'nei shalosh, Ashirim b'nei chamesh. If the parents are poor people and they are so attached to the child that they grieve, the child is the source of nachas in their life, then even if the child is only 3, then we eulogize the child. If the Ashirim lost the child, then the grief is not that intense and profound because they're not so dependent upon the child, they're wealthy. And therefore, unless the child is a 5-year-old, we don't have hespedim. He writes that the eulogy gives some measure of comfort to the deceased survivors. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Bishmo, Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Shmuel said, Aniyim b'nei chamesh, Ashir b'nei sheish. He had a slightly different text or transmission of the words and the ruling of Rabbi Shmuel, according to which the 2 ages are not 3 and 5, but rather 5 and 6. 5 for a poor person and 6 for a wealthy person. Ubnei zikenim kibnei amin aniyim. And if the elderly need the help of the child, and if they're so dependent on the child, and now the child never passes away, then we consider those children to be bnei aniyim. And even for the younger children, there will be hespedim, the elderly dependent upon the care from their child. Amar Rav Gidol bar Menashe, Amar Rav, Halach Rabbi Yehuda Shamar Mishum Rabbi Shmuel, and that is a chumrah, so to speak. But I guess it doesn't come under the halacha of halach kedivei mekil ba'avil, because this is really a reflection of perhaps the time and the place, the society, and the individual needs, and therefore there's a general rule that we wait until the child is 3 or 5 for eulogies. Dorish Rav Anani Bar Sason Apischa Debei Nesia, a drush of Rav Anani at the entranceway to the house of the Nasi, Yom Echad Lefnei Atzeres Ve'atzeres Harei Kan Arbasa. If there was already a mourning, a kiyum of niyug fails for 1 day, probably even for 1 hour, then Atzeres is Mevatel Shiva, like Pesach and Sukkot, so he counted as if he had mourned for 7 days. And in addition, the day of Atzeres forms a bittul of Shloshim, so that the 7 days of Shiva, which are Ke'ilu, halachic, legal days of Shiva, are now Ole Leminyan Shiva, not only Leminyan Shiva, but also Leminyan Shloshim. They generate another 7 days, all told 14 days, leaving a balance of 16 days of Shloshim. And this reflects something we saw back on Daf Chaf, that when a yontif falls out, then we not only consider the days, the yontif to be mevatel Shiva, and that gets rid of Shiva, but also the days of yontif are considered part of the days of Shloshim. Now, that's certainly true in the case of Pesach and Sukkot that are 7-day holidays. But in the case of Shavuos, we only have a 1-day holiday. And nevertheless, that 1-day regel takes the place of 7 days of Shloshim. Now, that might make sense at the time the Mikdash stood, when there was halach of tashlumin for the Simchas Chagiga Shel Simcha, the Shalmi Simcha. But why would that apply even Bisman Hazeh? And apparently Rav Hanani is of the opinion that even Bisman Hazeh, we have a 7-day of Yontif for Shavuos. Shomer Rabbi Abi the Ikpid. Why did Rav Hanani not mention this in the name of the originator of this halacha? Omar, what do the day is it his own original Torah? This ruling is the Rabbi Lazar. Omar Rabbi Yoshia. This is Rabbi Lazar in the name of Rav Oshia. And we'll see this in the Gemara soon. Darash Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha Kila Deresh Galutza Yom Echad Lifnei Atzeres Vatzeres Arei Kan Arbasar Yom. Same thing as we saw in Rav Hanani. And again, the response is Shomer Rav Sheshes Ve'ikpid. Omar Atu Didehi de Rabbi Eliezer Omar Rav Yoshia. He should have said in the name of the original person who ruled it. The Omar Rav Lazar Omar Rav Yoshia Minayin Latzeres Sheyesh Lehem Sheyesh Tashlumin Kol Shiva. How do we know that if you didn't bring the carbon at the beginning of Yontif, or in this case on Shavuos itself, the Shalmi Chagiga, then we give you Tashlum in a 7-day period, like we do in the case of Pesach. Shenever b'Chag HaMatzos b'Chag HaShavuos. On the same pasuk, it mentions both Chag HaMatzos and Chag HaShavuos to create a hekesh. Ma Chag HaMatzos yesh lo Tashlum kol Shiva. That if he didn't bring the Shalmi Chagiga on the first day of Pesach, we give him the entire balance of the Chag to bring in Shalmi Chagiga. So too, we give 7 days of Tashlumin for Chag HaShavuos yesh lo Tashlumin kol Shiva. Adberei Rav Papa Rav Avya Saba Vidorash. So that Rav Papa guided Rav Avya the elder on a walk through the city streets, and he announced Yom Echad Lifnei Rosh Hashanah Harei Kan Arba Asar. Once again, Yontif of Rosh Hashanah is going to be Mevatel Shiva, and it's going to count for 14 days of Shloshim. So once Rabbi Gamliel accepts the equation between Rosh Hashanah and Regel, the Mevatel Shiva, then he accepts and extends that comparison to the power of Rosh Hashanah to be Mevatel Shloshim, or to be Ola 7 days to Shloshim, adding 7 and 7, we subtract 14 from Shloshim. Again, the Kasha of the Rishonim here is very profound on this sugya, because it doesn't make any sense to put all the emphasis on the fact that Rosh Hashanah is considered like 7 days, because let's say Rosh Hashanah was not considered like 7 days. But what would happen is Rosh Hashanah would cancel Shiva, and then Yom Kippur, which is just 9 days after Rosh Hashanah, would then cancel Shloshim according to Rabbi Gamliel, because Rabbi Gamliel says that both Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are like Yontif. Amar Avina Hilkach Yom Echad Lifnei Achag V'Chag Shmini Shalo Harei Kan Esrim V'Echad Yom. When we have Shiva being observed for 1 day before Sukkot, then Sukkot comes in, it's Mevatel Shiva. Sukkot, the 7 days of Sukkot, is Ola Leminyan Shloshim, so that's already 14 days, plus Shmini Atzeres, which is a regel b'fnei atzmo, is also Ola Leminyan Sheva, because again, we said the Rosh Hashanah is Ola Leminyan Sheva according to Ram Gamliel, and therefore Shmini Atzeres as a regel b'fnei atzmo is Ola Leminyan Ola Sheva, so you've got 7, 7, 7, that's 21 days of Shloshim. Ravina Ikla L'Sura de Pras, Ravina came to the city of Sura de Pras, Amalei Rav Chaviva, Misur de Prasla Ravina, Omar Mar, is it true that you had said that Yom Echel Lifnei Rosh Hashanah Reikan Arbas or Yom? Amalei, Ana Mistabra Kiram Gamliel Hu Diamina. Ravina said it's logical that I was relying on Rabbi Gamliel, and therefore Rosh Hashanah is no different than any other regel, and therefore hence it's Ola for Arbas or Yom. The Mishnah says, Ein Korin v'lo Choltzin, the Ein Mavrin Ela Krovav Shalmes. Only the close relatives of the deceased will rip their garments as a kiyum of kriya. They will bare their shoulders as a kiyum of havelus, and that's part of the burial of the dead. And they will eat the special meal, the Sudas Havra, the first meal after Kvura, when they begin sitting in the base Avel, Shivas Yomi. And others who are not Krovim and are not obligated in the mitzvah of Avelus should not be doing so. Now, this might be a reflection of the fact that, number one, the minig is to tear the clothes at shoulder length, walk with the mita and expose the shoulder. And the minig of Sudas Havra means that the very first meal he should not be feeding himself, but rather should be provided by others. Now, an immediate relative of the deceased will mourn for the deceased. Let's say a child for his parents, a sibling for a sibling, a parent or a spouse for a child, or a husband for a wife, etc. And only they will cut kriya, bare their shoulders as part of the mitzvah of kvura, and eat the sudas havra as part of havelus of shiva. The ein mavrin ella al mita zekufa, and during the eating of the sudas havra, the avel will sit on a mita kfuya, but anyone else who's not a close relative and it's not chayv and avelus will not sit on a mita kfuya, but rather will sit on a mita zekufa. And this leads us to the Gemara on the top of Daf Chaf Hei Amud Aleph.